third missing ingredient. The majority of Bible readers today know little of the culture, customs, lifeways, and social dynamics depicted on the pages of the book they love. That's all right. Most people in the world are focused on their own culture and way of life because that is what surrounds them, and that is what they need to be successful in life. Studying the culture of some people far, far away, even those who lived long, long ago, a culture which is no more, seems irrelevant. Most people do not see that as something useful, and that is completely understandable. As a result of such state of things, most modern Bible readers may have some general framework about ancient Israelite, Greek, and Roman culture in their mind, but their understanding may be too general, too incomplete, and worse, twisted and inaccurate. And that is not very helpful when it comes to studying the Bible. In fact, it can cause us to take some wrong turns in understanding the Bible. It is indisputable that the Bible is full of rich social and cultural references tied to the time and place when those ancient words were written. Cultural references are unavoidable, and most often, they are left not understood unless they are familiar. Because we are not aware of them, cultural references are frequently passed by and ignored. They are often explained away in some roundabout ways. These are not malicious omissions, just our normal human limitations. We, humans, are very limited in our perception of reality and rarely aware of how much we do not know. I know that few readers of the Gospels are familiar with the world of ancient rabbis such as Jesus. He was indeed addressed as rabbi over a dozen times in 3 Gospel records. So he was a rabbi, but what did the first-century rabbis do? I will share some background information to show how such knowledge could be extremely helpful in interpreting the Gospels. A 2nd-century rabbinic text describes the objectives of a rabbi or a Torah teacher in the following way. The sages said 3 things: be deliberate in judgment, raise up many disciples, and make a fence around the Torah. Mishnah, Avo 1-1. The first 2 of these injunctions make sense. But what is a fence around the Torah? Just like a physical fence, a fence around the Torah is a protective enclosure around a commandment, in other words, an extra layer of rules. First, one has to scale the protective fence, and only then be in a position to transgress the actual holy commandment. This way, it will be more difficult for people to transgress the Torah. Sounds like rules upon rules, right? Well, for a good reason. If living righteously is the goal, then avoiding getting too close to crossing the proverbial line is a good practice. It safeguards us from coming dangerously close to sin. So fences around commandments were well-intended means of ensuring righteous living. So just like the rabbis of his day, Jesus built fences around commandments too. You have heard that it was said, "You shall not commit adultery." But I say to you that everyone who looks at a woman with lust for her has already committed adultery with her in his heart. Matthew 5:27-28. First, Yeshua quoted the original commandment, Exodus 20:14, and added, "But I say to you," and then comes Jesus' fence. Avoid lustful gazing. According to Yeshua, adultery and unfaithfulness come from looking at someone or something that is not yours, and suddenly the desire is born. He says that this is already a sin. But merely looking at people is actually not prohibited in the Torah. No, there is no such commandment. The fence is for protection. The goal of Jesus' fence is to avoid inappropriate gazing that leads to inappropriate desires, so that one will not commit the actual sin of adultery. This is an example of Jesus building a fence around a biblical commandment, as was the practice of many other rabbis of his day. The Sermon on the Mount passage is full of this technique. Unfortunately, I have seen people perform elaborate interpretive dances with these verses. If only people knew this simple technique of building fences around commandments, they could have explained Jesus' teaching so simply and cogently. Instead, each teaching of the Master built on top of the biblical commandment turns into the religious dictum vastly more spiritual and superior to the words of the Torah. Sadly, that is not what Jesus was doing in those verses. He was not giving a new or better Torah, but merely reinforcing the existing one. The one he said will stand till heaven and earth pass away. Matthew 5:18. Let's face it. Other people's cultures do not always make sense to us. But then we want to take those cultural messages and have them speak to us, have them teach us something valuable. We get lost. Sorry to break it to you, but like most great stories, most wisdom books, and philosophical works, the Bible is a very culturally bound message. It cannot be homogenized to be generic and universal, to make sense to any and every human being in whatever unique worldview they possess. Most people across the world are radically different from each other when it comes to perception, language, thought patterns, values, beliefs, and life practices. And the people of the Bible, the Jews, are like that as well. In ancient days, Israelites had a distinct agricultural practice that set them apart from the nations. They did not harvest the edges of their fields. The Torah says, "When you reap the harvest of your land, moreover, you shall not reap to the very corners of your field, nor gather the gleaning of your harvest. You are to leave them for the needy and the alien. I am the Lord your God." Leviticus 23:22. The idea of this agricultural charity is simple. Israelites were not to harvest everything, but rather leave the edges of their fields so that members of their community in need could gather the remaining crops and feed themselves. Curiously, God did not specify how much of one's land should remain unharvested. That was left up to the individual's conscience. Israel is commanded to share their harvest blessings with both their needy brethren and foreigners living among them. The Hebrew word for the corner of the field in this verse is pia. It can mean an edge, border, boundary, side, or corner. It can even mean forehead or temple in ancient Hebrew because they are considered the edge of one's face. So how far Israelites were to go with such practice was a matter of the heart. The Jewish cultural practice of not shaving or cutting the payot, corners or edges of the beard. If you run across those verses before, this might seem like a very strange commandment in the Bible. Why would God care how the Israelites styled their hair? Leviticus 19:27. Apparently, our appearances matter to the Almighty, and they say something about us to the world as well. Just as God expected His people to leave some produce on the corners of their fields for the poor, God also wanted Israel to be constantly reminded of this social responsibility. Their obligation to care for the neediest in their community should have been so ingrained in their lives that they would wear a reminder of this obligation on their faces. In this way, one's identity and one's appearance are inseparably tied to God's will for His Bible. One has to be willing to enter its unique world, even in part. And that means you might have to leave your world behind when you seek understanding. Yeshua was born in Israel, a Jew. He dressed like one, ate like one, talked like one, and shared thousands of other traits and life experiences with other Jews of his day. If we are to understand his culture, we have no choice but to study ancient Judean life and its values. One time, I was asked an intriguing question: did Jesus use leavened bread or matzah on Passover? I was a bit puzzled at first, because in my mind, of course, he used matzah, the unleavened bread. It's Passover, and such is the custom. So I had to clarify what exactly gave my questioner the impression that Jesus would eat anything besides matzah during the festival week in ancient Jerusalem. And as we discussed the topic further, it became clear that this was a really well-informed question. I am aware that some churches use regular bread for communion, sourdough, ciabatta, baguette, and etc. So my conversational partner was not alone in supposing that Yeshua actually used regular leavened bread during the Holy Week. The story says, while they were eating, Jesus took some bread, and after a blessing, he broke it and gave it to the disciples and said, "Take, eat, this is my body." Matthew 26:26 NASB. The Gospels literally say that Jesus broke bread and used the Greek word ardos. That is a direct equivalent of Hebrew, lechem, and the word indeed just means bread. The confusion comes from the fact that unleavened bread is a special term in the Greek language, atsumos, and the passage implies he used just regular bread, ardos. So the Gospels do not specifically say that Messiah broke and distributed atzumos, to his disciples on that night, so the interpretation comes straight from the original text of the Bible. This is when it finally dawned on me that this is a simple misunderstanding based on the ambiguity of language and lack of cultural knowledge. What was a mundane and implicit fact to me was not at all obvious to my questioner. So here is the answer I gave. Jesus did break ardos, bread, in the gospel story, but it was during the week of unleavened bread, Matthew 16:17. The story does not have to specify that this was unleavened bread, because that was the only kind of bread that would have been available that entire week in Jerusalem. Many people do not know this, but traditionally, all leaven is physically destroyed in Jewish communities one day before Passover begins. This is done on purpose, and today, there is even a special ceremony. Every housewife and every baker would have made sure they had no leaven or yeast in their possession in preparation for Passover. Why? Because it is expressly commanded by God, "For 7 days no leaven shall be seen with you in your entire territory." Deuteronomy 16:4. Yeshua's disciples would have had to make some very special arrangements to find any leavened bread around, to make sure it was available to them at a time when no leaven was found anywhere in Jerusalem. And people did not bake bread to last for several days back then. It was a daily activity. It should be noted that in Greek, ardos is a generic word for bread, just like lechem in Hebrew. In fact, ardos can be used idiomatically for food in general. The famous prayer says, "Give us this day our daily bread," Matthew 6:11. It does not mean all we ask for as sustenance is literally bread. Some vegetables and cheese, some olives, and maybe fruit would be wonderful too. But no, the text only mentions bread. Do we truly think God gave people bread and bread alone in response to such words? Of course not. God provides all sorts of food, and that is implied and understood because bread is a synecdoche for food in general.